I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A mid-October weekend in the Allegheny Mountains promised a quiet escape, crisp air, and the kind of solitude city life could never offer. The hunting cabin I rented was old, a small wooden structure tucked deep into the woods, far from the nearest road. The forest around it was dense, and the recent rain had left the ground wet and dark. Leaves coated the ground in shades of orange and brown, making the whole place feel like it belonged in a painting. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the light was fading, and the air smelled earthy and damp. My car tires crunched over wet leaves as I parked, and I took a moment to breathe in the cool mountain air. Everything about the place seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a single bedroom, a small living area, and a kitchen that had clearly seen better days. The wood smelled old, but it was dry inside, and the firewood stacked in the corner looked usable. I unpacked my gear slowly, taking the time to enjoy the quiet. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with dark clouds, and occasional gusts of wind rattled the roof. I lit the small wood stove, filled the kettle with water, and sat for a while staring out the window at the forest. There was no one around, and no sign of activity except for the occasional bird calling somewhere deep in the trees. It felt like a perfect escape. I went to bed around 10:30, tired from the drive and eager to wake early for a hike the next morning. I had brought a small flashlight, my backpack, and some supplies, but I didn't think I would need much. I was used to being alone in the city, but this kind of solitude felt different, heavier somehow. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of something heavy moving across the roof. My first thought was an animal, maybe raccoons or squirrels, but the sound was deliberate, like it was pacing, heavy steps across the shingles. I stayed still for a few seconds, hoping it was nothing, but the noise didn't stop. My stomach tightened. I lived in the city. I knew how to deal with strange sounds in an apartment building, but up here, isolated in the middle of the woods, the same noises felt different. Every thump of movement on the roof made my chest ache. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly got out of bed. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to open the window. Outside, the moon was low, barely lighting the wet leaves and muddy ground. That's when I saw them, muddy footprints, human footprints, leading from the edge of the treeline directly to my cabin. I froze. My car was still parked where I had left it, and my gear inside the cabin was untouched. There was no logical way anyone had gotten this close without me seeing them drive up, and yet there were footprints, unmistakably human, and they stopped at the cabin. My mind raced. Maybe someone had been camping nearby, I thought. Maybe a hunter like me had come close. But there was no tent, no fire, nothing. Just the footprints. They ended at my cabin door. I couldn't see where they had gone after that. The mud was disturbed, but the direction was unclear. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was an animal that had stepped in mud and somehow left prints resembling shoes. But no, the shape was too precise, too consistent. They looked like boots, and the weight, they had left deep impressions in the wet ground. My first instinct was to get out of the cabin entirely. I grabbed my coat, locked the door, and moved quickly to my car. I sat there for the rest of the night, shaking, listening to the rain drip off the roof and branches outside. Occasionally, I thought I heard something moving in the underbrush, a snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves, but I couldn't see anything. My flashlight scanned the trees endlessly, but nothing appeared. I didn't sleep at all. I just waited for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally began to rise, weak and gray behind the clouds, I forced myself out of the car and slowly approached the cabin. The footprints were gone. Completely gone. It was as if they had never existed. But on the cabin door, there were deep scratches, vertical marks that looked deliberate, like someone had tried to pry the door open or scratch their way in. I examined them closely. They were rough, messy, and jagged. Whoever had done this wasn't playing games. They wanted to get inside. I took careful photos of everything with my phone, my hands trembling. There was no one in sight. No footprints leading away, no discarded items. Nothing. Just the forest, silent and wet. I spent the next day cautiously gathering my belongings, moving slowly, constantly scanning the trees. Every shadow, every slight movement made my heart jump. I packed methodically, checking and double-checking that nothing was left behind, and that I had my keys, my backpack, and my flashlight. My plan was to leave and not return for at least a few months. When I drove out, I stayed on the main road, eyes glued to the treeline, every noise making me flinch. I didn't see anyone, and nothing seemed out of place, but the scratches on the door haunted me the entire drive home. After I returned, I contacted the cabin owner to ask if anyone had been in the area over the weekend. They assured me no one had approached the cabin, no other hunters, no maintenance workers, no hikers. They seemed genuine, but the unease lingered. I checked the news for any reports of break-ins or suspicious activity in the area, but nothing matched what I had experienced. I couldn't explain it. There were no cameras, no witnesses, just those footprints and the scratches on the door. I even considered that maybe someone had been watching the cabin for a while, waiting for the right moment. But the idea that someone would come all that way, leave tracks in the mud, then disappear completely without touching anything, it didn't make sense. Months later, I finally allowed myself to think about it without panic. I realized the forest itself, the isolation, had made the experience far more intense than it would have been in the city. But the scratches, the footprints, they were real, undeniable. And that realization made me cautious in a way I had never been before. I started traveling with more attention to exits, always keeping my phone charged, never leaving my car unlocked in remote areas. The incident changed the way I approached solitude in the woods. I never returned to that cabin. The owner still rents it out, and I hear it remains quiet most weekends, untouched by anyone. Sometimes I drive past the turnoff on the main road, and I think about the footprints, the scratches, and the fact that someone, or something, was close enough to reach the door and yet never made a sound outside the rain and wind. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't an animal. It was just someone who had been there when I wasn't expecting it, who left marks I couldn't explain. That fact, that simple, unembellished truth, is what stays with me. I've stayed in other remote cabins since then, in Maine, in the Rockies, in the Adirondacks. I've never had another night like that, but I've kept one rule. Never ignore a sound on the roof, never ignore footprints in the mud, and never underestimate the fact that someone else might be closer than you think. That weekend in the Allegheny Mountains taught me that real fear doesn't need monsters or ghosts. Real fear is simple, quiet, and real, and it stays with you long after the footprints have disappeared. By the time I finally feel safe enough to think about it, I understand that the scratches on that cabin door are not just marks in the wood. They are a reminder. A reminder that even in the middle of the woods, even when no one is supposed to be around, you are never truly alone. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. It was small, wooden, and isolated, sitting at the edge of a quiet field that sloped down toward the shore. The sun was low in the sky, and the long shadows of bare trees stretched across the ground, giving the place a slightly eerie feel, though I didn't think much of it at the time. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and gravelly, lined with mossy stones and tall pines that blocked most of the late sunlight. I parked my car on a small patch of dirt next to the cabin and looked around. There was no one else in sight, just the distant sound of waves breaking along the rocky coast and the occasional gull calling in the distance. The cabin itself looked like it hadn't changed much over the years. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof slightly sagging in one corner, and the windows clouded with age. A narrow porch ran along the front, with 2 rocking chairs and a small table covered in dust. The lockbox was attached to the porch railing, exactly where the owner had said it would be. I entered the code and retrieved the key, noting how heavy and old it felt in my hand. It was the kind of key that felt like it had been in use for decades, worn smooth by repeated handling. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The smell of old wood and dampness hit me immediately. The cabin was small, with a single main room that held a table, a few chairs, a small wood-burning stove, and a lofted bedroom area. Everything was simple, utilitarian, and quiet in a way that made me feel both safe and oddly exposed. After settling in, I decided to take a walk along the shore. The sky was fading from pale orange to gray as I followed a narrow dirt path leading down to the water. The tide was out, leaving wide stretches of wet sand and rocks slick with seaweed. The waves were slow and calm, just the occasional crash against a boulder. I walked for nearly an hour, picking up interesting stones and watching the occasional crabs scuttle into the tide pools. The air was cold but clean, sharp with salt and the faint scent of decaying seaweed. After a while, I turned back, knowing that darkness would fall quickly and the cabin would be a welcome sight. When I returned, the first thing I noticed was that the key was no longer in the lockbox. I frowned, assuming I must have accidentally dropped it somewhere on the path, or maybe it had slipped back into the box and I hadn't noticed. I checked the ground around the porch, the steps, even the table on the porch, but it was gone. Shrugging, I tried the door, expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The door opened easily, and I stepped inside, feeling a slight chill run down my spine. The room was exactly as I had left it, nothing disturbed, no signs of anyone else having been there. I put it down to the wind or my own carelessness and tried not to dwell on it. That night, I made a small fire in the stove and cooked some dinner. The wind outside had picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls and rattling the windows. I listened for any sounds beyond the wind and the distant surf, trying to reassure myself that nothing was wrong. I double-checked the doors and windows, feeling a little uneasy about the missing key, but told myself it was probably fine. I went to bed around 10, leaving a lamp on in the corner for light. The bed was narrow but firm, and I fell asleep to the rhythmic sound of wind and waves. Around 11:50, I woke suddenly. There was a scratching sound at the back door, slow and deliberate, like someone testing the handle or moving something heavy against the wood. My stomach tightened. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, only to find the screen dark. Dead. I cursed under my breath, realizing I hadn't charged it after using it during the day. I grabbed the fire poker from the stove and crept toward the door. The scratching had stopped, but my instincts told me it hadn't gone away. Slowly, I opened the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The porch was empty. Muddy footprints led from the back door into the woods beyond the cabin. Only one set, and they were wet, glistening faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the trees. I didn't wait around to investigate further. I closed the door, bolted it as best as I could, and sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the fire poker, trying to calm my racing heart. I listened for hours, every creak of the cabin making me flinch. The wind picked up, branches scraping against the windows, and I imagined the footprints coming closer, retreating, circling, but I never saw anyone. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When dawn broke, I didn't sleep at all, only sitting in the chair by the window and staring out at the gray morning. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence over the property. I packed quickly, making sure I hadn't left anything behind. Before leaving, I went outside to examine the ground around the cabin. The footprints from the back door were still there, leading straight into the trees, ending abruptly where the forest thickened. There was no sign of anyone hiding nearby, no discarded items, nothing to indicate that someone had been waiting there. The key, of course, was still missing. My unease was replaced by a solid, cold fear. Someone had been here while I was inside, and I hadn't even known it. I drove away without looking back, taking the long, twisting road back toward Bar Harbor. The trees thinned, and the first signs of other houses and people started to appear, but the uneasiness didn't leave me. When I returned the key to the owner as instructed, I asked casually if anyone else had reported issues with the cabin. She hesitated, then admitted that the last renter had mentioned someone entering the cabin, though the report had been vague. No one had been caught, no evidence left behind, and the cabin was supposed to be completely isolated and secure. It wasn't until later, thinking back over that night, that I realized how vulnerable I had been. The door had been unlocked, the key gone, and I had no way to call for help. The footprints, the sound of scratching, the emptiness of the forest. Everything pointed to someone watching the cabin, someone prepared to enter, and someone who knew exactly how isolated the place was. I never went back, and I never stayed at a cabin alone after that. The memory of that night, of sitting in a small room with only a fire poker for protection while someone, or something, walked unseen just outside, stayed with me for years. It was a reminder that isolation can be far more dangerous than anyone realizes, and that even a simple, empty cabin on a quiet shore can hold real threats. The next renter, I was told, had been extra cautious, checking every window and door, and the owner finally decided to add a combination lock to the porch door for good measure. I kept the memory in my mind as a warning. Sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural, they're simply real. I rented a small, wooden cabin deep in the woods for a week. The cabin sat at the edge of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by dense pine and fir trees, with no other houses for miles. I had chosen it for the quiet, hoping to escape the constant noise of the city and the relentless hum of my thoughts. The first afternoon I arrived, I parked my car on the uneven gravel driveway and walked around the cabin. It was old but sturdy, with a slanted roof, moss growing along the edges, and a small chimney that hadn't been used in a while. The windows were dusty, and the wooden siding had grayed over time. I opened the door and stepped inside. The smell of old wood and faint mildew filled the air. It was dark, but the late afternoon light filtered through the thin curtains, casting long, uneven shadows across the floorboards. The interior was sparse. There was a small kitchen area with a gas stove, a fridge that hummed faintly, and a sink with slightly rusty faucets. A wooden table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, and a sofa pushed against one wall looked like it hadn't been sat on in years. A small bedroom was off to the side, with a thin mattress on a metal frame. I placed my bag down, unpacked my clothes, and tried to settle in. By nightfall, the forest had grown dark and silent. The cabin felt smaller than I had thought during the day. The walls seemed thin, and every creak and groan of the wooden frame made me aware that I was completely alone. I lit a lamp on the table and made some instant noodles for dinner. The warm food and the light made the cabin feel slightly more welcoming, but there was still an unease I couldn't shake. As I cleaned up and moved to the bedroom, I noticed the wind had picked up outside. It rattled the windows and pushed through small cracks around the door. I checked the locks and double-checked the windows before turning off the lamp. The darkness inside the cabin was dense, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the thin curtains. The silence was heavy, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the distant rustle of trees. Around midnight, I was woken by a sharp, scratching noise coming from the back of the cabin. My first thought was that it was a branch brushing against the siding, but the sound repeated, deliberate and heavier. I froze for a moment, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The scratching moved from the back wall to the side of the cabin, slow and irregular. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the kitchen, shining the beam out of the nearest window. The darkness of the forest stretched endlessly, and I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. The scratching stopped abruptly, and silence returned. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. Sleep was difficult after that. I lay awake, listening to every sound, the wind, the occasional snap of a twig outside, the hum of the fridge. Hours later, I was woken again, this time by footsteps on the porch. They were slow and deliberate, as if someone was testing the floorboards. My stomach dropped. I didn't hear a car door, or any movement in the driveway. Whoever it was had come on foot. I stayed still, holding my flashlight under the covers, and waited. The footsteps stopped. The scratching returned, but now it was on the door handle. I could see it moving slightly under the thin layer of frost that had formed overnight. I debated calling someone, but my cell service was spotty, and I hadn't told anyone where I was. The nearest ranger station was miles away. My hands shook as I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the kitchen and crept toward the door. I pressed my ear to it, listening. The scratching had stopped, replaced by faint breathing, slow and uneven. My mind raced with possibilities, thief, vandal, maybe just an animal, but none of them made me feel safer. I pulled back slightly and considered the windows. I could barricade them with the furniture. That might buy me time until morning. I moved quickly, pushing the table against the door and the sofa under the windows. The sound of the wind intensified, making it hard to distinguish what was real and what was imagined. I could hear the boards of the porch creak under weight again. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was patient. I could hear breathing through the door now, almost synchronized with my own rapid inhalations. I crouched behind the table, clutching the skillet, waiting. Time stretched. Hours seemed to pass, but it might have only been minutes. I tried to focus on my breathing and stay as quiet as possible. Eventually, the noises stopped, and a tense silence fell over the cabin. My muscles ached from crouching, and I was exhausted. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I had to act if I wanted to get out safely. I grabbed my coat, boots, and a backpack, stuffing the few essentials I had into it. I checked that the flashlight worked, then slowly moved toward the back door. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and my heart leapt with every sound. I opened the door just enough to slip out and immediately felt the biting cold of the night. The wind whipped through the trees, and the snow crunched under my boots. I didn't look back. I ran down the path toward my car, branches whipping against my face, my breath visible in the cold air. My flashlight barely illuminated the narrow road, and the trees seemed to close in on me from both sides. Every shadow felt like it was moving, every sound amplified. When I finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands numb from the cold and trembling from fear. I got the door open, jumped inside, and locked it immediately. My chest heaved as I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the path ahead. I drove slowly at first, listening for any sound of pursuit, but there was nothing. The forest receded behind me, and the isolation that had felt oppressive now felt like a relief. It took nearly an hour to reach the nearest gas station, where I stopped to catch my breath and gather myself. I called the local authorities and reported what had happened, explaining as best I could. They told me a few hikers had been reported missing in the area recently, but they didn't have any suspects. I stayed at the station for the rest of the night, drinking coffee and trying to calm my nerves. By morning, I had rented a motel room further away from the woods. I stayed there for a couple of days, making sure I was safe before I felt comfortable returning to the city. The cabin remained in my mind, a mix of beauty and danger, a reminder of how small and vulnerable a person could feel when truly alone. I never returned, and I made a mental note to stick to areas that weren't completely isolated in the future. I realized that solitude can be peaceful, but it can also make fear feel larger than it actually is, and sometimes, it's better to be alone somewhere safer than isolated in the unknown. That night in the cabin taught me something important. Preparation and awareness are critical, and instinct matters more than bravery. I had survived, and I made sure to take that lesson with me. I left the cabin behind, closed the door for the last time, and drove away with a deep sense of relief, knowing that I had faced fear and come out intact. The woods were still there, silent and unyielding, but I was far enough now to feel safe. I never doubted again the importance of respecting isolation and understanding just how alone one can be in a place that seems beautiful by day but unforgiving by night. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a long, exhausting stretch of work and the constant pressure of city life, I needed a break. My friends and I decided to rent a cabin near Crater Lake in southern Oregon. We found a small, rustic place that wasn't listed on any major rental sites, tucked away on a dirt road that narrowed into a single lane before disappearing into dense trees. The surrounding forest was thick, mostly pines and firs, with occasional clearings that gave brief glimpses of the lake's distant blue rim. It was exactly what I wanted: quiet, isolated, a place where we could hike, drink, and enjoy the kind of solitude that felt impossible back in town. We arrived in the late afternoon. Snow from the previous week had melted into puddles in the dirt road, leaving a trail of mud that splashed up the tires of the car. The cabin itself was small, maybe 2 rooms, built decades ago. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sagging slightly in the middle, and the porch boards creaked under every step. Inside, it smelled of old pine and dust, with a faint mustiness that came from years of being closed up during the off-season. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a couple of folding chairs, a tiny kitchenette, and 2 single beds pushed together with a lumpy mattress. We unpacked quickly, eager to get out for a short hike before night fell. The trail we chose wound through the forest, following a small creek that ran in thin streams over rocks and fallen branches. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine needles. Sunlight filtered through the bare branches, casting long shadows across the moss-covered ground. Everything felt calm, almost too calm, like the world had paused for us. Night came quickly. By 8, we were back at the cabin, exhausted from the hike and ready for a few beers. The forest around us had gone completely silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees or the distant call of an owl. We stayed inside, laughing at small things, feeling safe in the warm light of the cabin. My dog, a medium-sized mutt with a thick coat, slept on the floor near the stove, her breathing even and steady. Around midnight, I woke to a low, urgent barking. My dog was at the window, hackles raised, growling in a way I had never heard before. I shook off the sleep and walked quietly over to the window. At first, I saw nothing but the shadows of trees under the pale light of the moon. Then, at the very edge of the treeline, I saw him. A man, standing still, barely visible in the dim light. He wore a dirty, faded work shirt and pants that blended with the forest shadows. In his hands, he held something long, though I couldn't make out exactly what it was. My heart started to race. I went to wake my friend, who groaned but eventually sat up. I pointed to the window, and we grabbed a flashlight together. The beam swept over the edge of the forest, cutting through the darkness, but the man was gone. It was as if he had vanished. I stayed awake the rest of the night, keeping my dog close and listening for any sound, footsteps, snapping twigs, the faint shuffle of someone moving in the trees. But there was nothing. The next morning, we explored around the cabin, trying to convince ourselves it had been a trick of the light. That's when we found the boot print in the mud, clear and deep. One print, fresh, leading from the treeline directly to the cabin door. My stomach twisted. No one had entered, nothing was missing, and yet there it was. That single, undeniable sign that someone had been there while we slept. We tried to shake it off, telling ourselves it must have been a local passing by or a hunter. Still, the unease stayed with me. The forest that had seemed peaceful and inviting the day before now felt heavy and watchful. The second night, I decided to set up a motion sensor camera outside the cabin. I wanted proof, something to show that it wasn't just my imagination. I positioned it near the side of the cabin, where the door opened onto the small clearing. The camera was aimed at the treeline, where we had seen him the night before. Around 1 a.m., a thump on the roof startled me. My dog barked again, low and threatening, and I froze, listening. The sound came again, heavier this time, as if someone had walked across the top of the cabin. My hands shook as I grabbed the flashlight, heart hammering against my ribs. I peered out, but the forest was dark and still, nothing moving. The next morning, I retrieved the footage from the camera. My stomach dropped when I saw it. The video showed a man walking up to the cabin from the treeline, his steps deliberate. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring directly at the camera. His face was shadowed, but there was something in the way he paused that made my skin crawl. He didn't move for several seconds, just stood there, staring. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees as silently as he had arrived. That was the moment we decided to leave. We packed our things quickly, my hands trembling the entire time. Every sound in the forest felt magnified, the crunch of leaves under our feet, the distant caw of a crow, the snap of a twig. Even the light snow falling from the clouds above felt menacing, each flake a reminder that the wilderness could hide anyone. Before we left, I made one last sweep of the cabin. Every window was closed, the door locked, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the image of the man standing there, watching us, silent and patient. As we drove away, the dirt road narrowing into the forest, I glanced back at the cabin. The treeline behind it looked normal again, quiet and empty, but I knew what I had seen. Weeks later, I told myself it had to have been a transient or someone living rough in the woods. There was no other explanation. No one had harmed us, no one had stolen anything, and yet, the presence had been real. Every time I think back, I can feel the cold weight of the night and the way the forest seemed to hold its breath around us. That trip changed the way I saw the wilderness. I used to think isolation was peaceful, a chance to disconnect. Now I understand that being truly alone, especially in a place few others know about, can make you feel like you're being watched in a way you can't shake. We don't go back. The cabin remains on that dirt road near Crater Lake, hidden and quiet, but I still picture him sometimes. The man at the treeline, patient, silent, and waiting. The memory doesn't haunt me in a supernatural way. It's the realism of it that sticks. Someone had been out there, close enough to touch, close enough to threaten, and we had no idea what they wanted. It's a lesson I won't forget. Solitude can be deceptive. Nature isn't forgiving, and the people who move through it unnoticed can be far more terrifying than anything you imagine. I've gone on other trips since, always in populated areas, always with multiple cabins nearby, never alone. The forest can be beautiful, serene, and peaceful, but it can also be a place where you are completely exposed, and some dangers aren't obvious until you're staring them in the face. Even now, when I see a treeline from the window of a cabin or a campsite, I pause. The memory comes back, the chill, the barking, the boot print in the mud, and the man who disappeared into the trees without a sound. I can't explain why he was there, and I may never know, but the feeling he left behind is unmistakable. That is the kind of fear that stays with you long after you've left the woods behind. I rented a small, rustic cabin in Stowe, Vermont, during the off-season, hoping for a quiet weekend to read, hike, and get away from the constant noise and chaos of city life. The drive up was long and cold, the roads winding through empty forests, and by the time I arrived, late afternoon had already begun to fade into early evening. The snow had started falling lightly, dusting the trees and the ground with a thin, white layer. It was beautiful in that stark, empty way that only late autumn and early winter in Vermont can be, but it was also silent in a way that made you notice every small sound, like the wind rustling the bare branches or the crunch of my boots on the half-frozen gravel driveway. The cabin itself was small, older, and rustic. Its wooden frame had settled over decades, leaving the floors slightly uneven and the windows rattling in the evening breeze. When I first stepped inside, the smell of old wood and damp earth hit me, a musty, slightly sour odor that was unpleasant at first but grew on me as I moved around. There were remnants of previous tenants, an old, chipped rocking chair in the corner, a stack of yellowed newspapers, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The furniture was simple and worn, the kind that felt like it had absorbed decades of quiet life. I unpacked my small bag, fed my dog, and settled into the living room with a fire I managed to get going, the warm glow fighting back the chill that clung to the wooden walls. As the light outside faded and night crept in, I noticed a door I hadn't seen in the listing photos or on my initial walk through. It was in the corner of the living room, made of thick, dark wood, with no visible keyhole or handle beyond a simple metal latch. It wasn't hidden, exactly, but somehow I had missed it until now. Something about it made my skin prickle, not fear, exactly, just unease. I approached it slowly and pushed gently. The door didn't budge. Locked. I tried to look underneath the bottom edge, but the floorboards had settled close to the wood. I couldn't see anything, just darkness. The cabin was small, and I had explored every inch, so the presence of this door felt almost deliberate, as though it had been placed there to be ignored or forgotten. I went back to the fire, trying to distract myself with a book, telling myself it was just an old cabin, and that locked doors were normal, even comforting in some way. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, the world narrowing to the dim glow of the fire and the muted sounds of winter. My dog curled up at my feet, her breathing calm, but occasionally she lifted her head, ears twitching at small noises I barely noticed myself. I finally decided to turn in for the night, dragging my sleeping bag across the floor near the fireplace, so I could feel its warmth even if the cabin itself cooled quickly. Around 2 a.m. I woke. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound persisted. Scrape, 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 slow, deliberate, coming from the corner of the living room. My heart started to beat faster, my stomach tightening. The noise was soft, but in the silence of the night, it was impossible to ignore. My dog's growl rumbled low in her throat, a sound I had never heard from her before. She refused to move from the spot at my feet, eyes fixed on that dark corner, hackles raised. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was the wind, or perhaps an animal outside. The scraping continued, and the unease settled into a deep, gnawing fear. I grabbed my phone, intending to call the cabin owner, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I had known this in advance. Part of the appeal of renting a remote cabin was the isolation, the chance to be away from the constant buzz of connection. But right then, the isolation felt heavy, oppressive. The scratching stopped. Silence, thick and suffocating. I exhaled, trying to steady my shaking hands, but just as I was about to convince myself it had been a dream, I heard it. A whisper, low and urgent, coming from the locked door. "Let me out." The words were quiet, almost too quiet to be sure I had heard them, but my dog reacted instantly, growling sharply. Her fur was standing on end, and she braced herself, body tense and ready. I couldn't rationalize the sound. I am not a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits, but the voice had been human. Deliberate. Something about the way it came through the door, contained yet persistent, made my chest tighten with real fear. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I considered smashing the door, trying to open it, but something stopped me. I didn't know what was behind it. An instinct screamed that force would only make things worse. The rest of the night was a blur. I sat by the fire, dog pressed against me, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, every small sound amplified in the dark. Occasionally, I thought I heard scratching again, faint and tentative like fingernails against wood, but I never looked. I didn't want to. The hours crawled by, the snow outside falling heavier, covering the cabin in a muffled, white silence. I didn't sleep. When dawn finally came, gray and cold and quiet, I was physically and mentally exhausted. My hands shook as I packed, my stomach still tight from the tension and fear. I didn't even touch my planned breakfast. I opened the door to the cabin and stepped out, feeling the crunch of snow under my boots. My dog stayed close, glancing at the cabin with something I interpreted as suspicion, maybe even fear. I drove away slowly, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white, through the thin snow and quiet roads. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the main road and civilization again, I could feel my muscles starting to relax, but the memory of that night, the sound of that whisper, stayed with me. It was not imagination. I had no doubt. Something had been in that room, behind that door. Something that had tried to communicate. Later, I found out from local records that the cabin had been built on the remains of an old boarding house that had burned down decades ago. Several people had died in a basement fire, trapped when the stairwell had collapsed. The door I had seen, the one I hadn't noticed before, led to a sealed-off portion of that basement. It was never used again, closed off for safety, or perhaps forgotten. The thought that the sounds I heard could have been caused by settling wood or small animals seems rational, but it doesn't explain the whisper. It doesn't explain the deliberate scraping, the low urgency in a human-like tone. I didn't want to consider how or why that sound had traveled to the living room, but the rational explanations fell apart in the face of memory. The experience taught me something about fear, about isolation, and about the layers of history that live quietly in old buildings. I've stayed in cabins before in remote places, but I've never been anywhere with the weight of presence that Stowe cabin had. I've returned to Vermont since, but I avoid that area entirely, preferring other trails, other towns, other quiet escapes. The memory stays with me, sharp, like the cold air on my face that first night, or the scrape of fingernails against old wood. I know I will never stay in that cabin again. I don't need proof or stories to remind me why. The feeling of that night, the unease and the certainty that something had been behind that door is enough. And for me, it is enough to stay away. I rented a small, isolated cabin in the mountains of northern Maine for a long weekend. I had been looking for a place far from the city, somewhere quiet, where I could spend a few days reading, hiking, and just being alone. The cabin was set back from the road, surrounded by thick woods on all sides, with a narrow dirt path leading to it. When I first arrived, the sun was already low in the sky, and the shadows of the tall pines stretched across the ground like long fingers. The air smelled damp, cold, and earthy, and I could hear the faint gurgle of a stream not far from the cabin. The cabin itself was small, made of dark, weathered wood, with a stone chimney and a metal roof that creaked whenever the wind blew. There was no electricity, except for a single generator that I was told I could use if needed, and a wood stove in the main room for heat. I parked my car at the edge of the path, grabbed my bags, and walked to the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and each step made a slight squish under my boots. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, probably deer or raccoons, winding through the trees around the cabin. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and smoke from the previous occupant. The furniture was sparse: a small wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a shelf filled with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I set my things down and went to the windows, looking out at the forest. The sky was turning orange, and the tops of the trees swayed gently in the breeze. I could see the stream glinting in the distance, and a small clearing where sunlight still reached the forest floor. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the kind of quiet you notice only when you're far from people. After settling in, I started a fire in the wood stove. It took a while to get the damp wood to catch, but eventually, a small flame grew, crackling and throwing warmth into the cabin. I ate some simple food I had brought, a sandwich and a couple of apples, and then sat by the fire with a book. The room was dimly lit by the firelight and the fading sun, the shadows of the logs and furniture flickering across the walls. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, and every so often, I heard the thump of something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just wildlife, nothing to worry about. Night came quickly. By the time the sky was completely dark, the temperature had dropped sharply. I added more wood to the stove and wrapped myself in a blanket. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the roof and the soft whistle of wind through the trees. I tried to read, but every sound outside seemed louder than before. Twigs snapping underfoot, leaves brushing together, the distant call of an owl. I reminded myself that I was alone, and that the sounds were normal for a forest at night. Still, there was a tension in the air, a feeling that someone or something was watching, even though I knew it was just imagination. Around midnight, I decided to get some sleep. I lay on the narrow bed and listened to the wind. At first, I tried to focus on the steady rhythm of my breathing, but then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, like someone moving deliberately through the woods, careful not to make much noise, but close enough that I could hear the crack of small branches underfoot. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote, but the pattern of movement didn't seem right. It was deliberate, almost calculated. I stayed on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The sound stopped, then started again a few minutes later, coming from a different direction. I realized it was moving around the cabin. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone had followed me from the road. Maybe it was a local checking on their property. Maybe I had left something out that drew attention. I didn't have a phone signal, so I couldn't call anyone. The thought of being completely cut off from help made my stomach twist. I got up quietly and moved to the window, peering through the glass. The darkness outside was thick, almost tangible, and I could barely make out the shapes of trees. I strained my eyes, but I saw nothing. Then I noticed a movement near the edge of the clearing. A figure? I couldn't tell. My heart hammered in my chest, and I stepped back from the window. I knew I had to stay calm, but the instinct to check outside was strong. I decided to lock the door and barricade it with a chair. I stacked some heavy books and a small table in front of it, just in case. The sound outside didn't come immediately after that, but the tension remained. I could hear my own heartbeat and the occasional gust of wind shaking the branches. Hours seemed to pass slowly. I stayed awake, sitting by the stove with a baseball bat I had found in the corner of the cabin. I listened to the forest, cataloging every sound: the stream trickling, a branch snapping far off, the rustle of leaves. Nothing approached. By dawn, the wind had died down, and the forest seemed almost normal again. The sun filtered through the trees, and I could see deer grazing in the clearing, unaware of the night that had just passed. I stepped outside carefully, the ground damp under my boots. The air was cold and fresh. I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of what had been moving outside. There were footprints, human footprints, large, heavy boots, circling the cabin, but they stopped at the edge of the trees and didn't lead away. Someone had been there, and then left, deliberately avoiding the road. I didn't see any signs of theft or damage, just the evidence that I had been observed. I decided not to stay another night. I packed quickly, loading my gear into the car. As I drove down the narrow dirt path, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The forest was quiet, serene, almost welcoming in the daylight. The tension of the night faded with each mile, replaced by relief and a strange sense of gratitude. I had been alone, truly alone, in the woods, and had faced the unknown without panicking, without making a sound, without putting myself at risk. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was fully up. The small town at the edge of the forest looked normal. People going about their day, cars passing, dogs barking. I stopped at a diner for coffee and breakfast, feeling a wave of normalcy wash over me. I knew I would never forget that night, the fear, the uncertainty, the silence that pressed down on me, but I also knew that I had handled it. Later, I reflected on the experience and realized that it had changed me. I had learned patience, observation, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. I hadn't been hurt. Nothing had escalated. The experience had been frightening but real, grounded in actual events, not imagination. It was a story I could carry with me without fear, a reminder of the strength I found in myself when everything seemed uncertain. That cabin in the woods remained standing when I passed by months later. I saw no signs of anyone living there, no footprints, no disturbances. It was just a small, weathered building, quiet and alone, like it had always been. And I realized that sometimes the scariest experiences are not about monsters or ghosts. They're about facing the unknown, being truly alone, and learning that you are capable of more than you thought. I left the forest behind that day, feeling lighter, more aware, and strangely empowered. I had survived, and I had learned. I arrived at the small cabin near Lake Crescent just as the sun was setting, the sky turning soft shades of orange and pink over the water. The lake was quiet, glassy, reflecting the dense, evergreen trees along the shoreline. The road leading up to the cabin had been narrow, winding through the forest, and by the time I pulled into the small clearing, I realized how isolated the place really was. There were no other cabins in sight, no sounds of cars, no voices, just the wind moving through the spruce and fir trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. I had wanted solitude, a break from the noise of the city, and I had certainly found it. The cabin was modest, wooden, and smelled faintly of damp pine and old smoke. It had a small porch, a single room that served as both living area and bedroom, and a kitchen corner with a tiny stove and a sink. There was a fireplace, though I didn't have much firewood, and a single window facing the lake. I unpacked slowly, putting away my clothes and supplies, and took a moment to look out at the water. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of the lake and wet earth. I could hear the gentle lapping of water against the rocks, and everything felt peaceful, almost unreal in its stillness. After dinner, I sat in a wooden chair near the window, sipping coffee and staring at the lake. My dog lay curled at my feet, her soft breathing the only sound inside the cabin. As night fell, the forest around the cabin became darker and denser, shadows stretching across the clearing. I turned off the lights and let my eyes adjust to the darkness, enjoying the quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of every small sound. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of water against the shore. By midnight, I felt tired and went to bed, leaving the window slightly cracked to let in the cool night air. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a strange sensation. At first, it was subtle, a feeling that something was different. Then I saw it, lights moving in the forest outside. They were bright, almost white, and hovered just above the treetops. At first, I assumed it was some campers with lanterns or flashlights, maybe people walking along a trail I hadn't noticed. But something didn't feel right. The lake was empty, completely silent except for the water and wind. There was no sound of voices, no distant laughter or movement beyond the lights themselves. They weren't moving like someone walking. They glided, stopping and starting in ways that didn't make sense. The lights moved closer to the cabin, hovering above the tree line for a moment, then vanished completely. It was as if they had simply disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing behind. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. My dog growled softly, her hackles raised. The hairs on my arms stood up, and then the sound came, a heavy pounding on the door from outside. Not a knock, not a tap, but a steady, forceful thud that made the cabin shake. My dog barked uncontrollably, jumping to the window and whining, pressing herself against me. I froze, unsure whether to open the door or hide. My phone was in the corner, and I dialed the ranger station, hoping someone could tell me what was happening, maybe that it was just some prank or a bear. The line was dead. Silent clicks, then nothing. No dial tone, no ring, just emptiness. The pounding stopped after what felt like an eternity. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven. Outside, the forest was quiet again, the darkness pressing close to the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it around, but the beam cut through nothing but trees and fog drifting low over the lake. There was no one there. No movement, no sound beyond the wind through the branches. My dog whimpered, pressed close against my side, and I tried to convince myself that whatever it was had left. Bears, maybe, or a fallen branch. But the weight of the fear wouldn't lift. Something had been there, something that had intentionally tried to force its way inside. I stayed in bed the rest of the night, flashlight within reach, every shadow in the room stretching into something menacing. My dog refused to sleep, growling at every creak, every brush of wind against the cabin walls. I didn't close my eyes fully, waiting for dawn, knowing there was no one I could call, and no way to leave without stepping outside into the unknown. Hours dragged, slow and heavy. Finally, the first pale light of morning came through the window. I waited for a moment, listening for any sounds. There was nothing, just the soft murmur of the lake, the occasional rustle of a bird in the trees. I got up cautiously, my dog at my heels, and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold and damp. Leaves were wet and pressed into the ground. I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning for tracks or signs of anyone who might have been outside the night before. There were none. No footprints, no tire marks, no broken branches that could indicate a person or an animal had come close. The only unusual mark was on the door itself, an imprint deep in the wood, shaped like something large had pressed against it with great force. It was hard to describe, but it wasn't human. The door had splintered slightly, as if the weight of something massive had leaned or pushed against it. Everything else around the cabin looked untouched, completely ordinary. It made no sense. I walked down to the edge of the lake, letting the water calm me. The fog had lifted, the surface was smooth, and the forest seemed normal, peaceful again. I stayed there for a long time, scanning the trees, listening to the lake, trying to make sense of the night's events. Eventually, I returned to the cabin, packed my things, and left. The road back through the forest seemed longer, somehow darker, but nothing followed me. I didn't stop for long anywhere along the way. By the time I reached the nearest town, I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief, trying to rationalize what had happened. Something had been there, something very real, very deliberate, but I would never know what. The memory of the pounding, the hovering lights, and the pressed imprint on the door stayed with me, clear and sharp. I never returned to Lake Crescent after that night. I thought about it often, about what might have been in the forest, and why it had come so close. I told myself it could have been an animal, or someone trying to scare me, but nothing matched the precision, the eeriness of those lights, the way whatever it was had pressed against my door and then vanished without leaving any trace. The cabin sat empty in my mind for years, a place I had touched only once, but the memory of that night stayed. Quiet, isolated, real, and terrifying in the most ordinary way. Every time I think about it, I remember the weight of fear pressing down, the helplessness, and the way the world outside that cabin felt utterly alive and unknowable. Even now, I can picture the lake, the fog, and the darkness pressing against the small walls of that cabin, and I know I'll never go back.